Hey, welcome everyone to the next session. Literature is a movable feast for language teachers and learners. Greta Gorsuch is going to be giving us her presentation. She does intend to record this, or actually it's recording already. So if you don't want your image or name showing up in the recording, please change it or keep your camera off. If I could ask everybody to please mute yourselves if you haven't already. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that and we'll break in to ask the questions as they pop up. Okay, without further ado, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much. This conference has been really fascinating for me so far. And I managed to come in a bit early tonight. It's Sunday night where I am, which is in West Texas, Lubbock, Texas. And I just saw a really interesting presentation on using 3 different schools of Japanese psychology and counseling in the classroom. Is really fascinating. So I've just been completely impressed with the presentations, but also how well this platform has been working. So thank you again to Mary Hillis and also Suzanne Kamada, who's there, for inviting me to be a featured speaker. It's a real honor for me. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. And it's a PowerPoint. And this presentation is Literature is a Movable Feast for language teachers and learners. If you have any questions whatsoever, please send them in chat bar, but also contact me privately. There's my email. TTU stands for Texas Tech University. And I also have a website. All right, so when I was invited to talk to you, I'm going to stop sharing this for a second and see if I can repair this a little bit. Now we'll try sharing screen, see if we get a slightly better look. That's better. All right, excellent. So when I was invited to talk to you, first of all, it came as a huge surprise. I wasn't expecting it. But I was very pleased. But when I was invited to talk to you, I had just finished reading Ernest Hemingway's 1964 memoir called A Moveable Feast. And it turns out that his title alone generated very lively discussion. You know, just what did he mean by a movable feast? What do you mean by that? And in fact, if you go to a very interesting website called Goodreads,
sorry, I hate to interrupt. Could you, someone's asking if you could go back to your first slide so they can see your email address again? Thank you.
Of course. There it is, greta.gorsuch@ttu.edu and then gretareaders.com. All right, I'm gonna advance. We are short on time. And Goodreads is a really great website to look at. And there's a very lively discussion there about Hemingway's title. For example, experiences are movable feasts. So I'm quoting directly from this very long and still continuous discussion. Living in Paris gives you a feast no matter where you go. My favorite, the past, the present, and the future are movable feasts. And finally, your multiple incarnations, past lives, and the whole bit are a movable feast. And I did say the discussion was lively. It went all over the place. But I decided that I wanted the phrase a movable feast to mean that narrative literature always provides culture, enjoyment, insights, and experience. And it doesn't matter where you are or whether you are teaching or learning, it always provides. Narrative texts are wonderful. And I wanted to share with you the first book that I ever read on my own. I actually managed to acquire one of the few remaining copies. It was published in 1961, don't tell anyone. It's called Honey Bunch and Norman and the Paper Lantern Mystery. And perhaps some of you are here for the same reason that I am. I love to read. But as a teacher, you know, I can't deny that books like the Paper Lantern Mystery and many others have just been invaluable to me on so many levels. And there have been many times when I had more ready access to books and then the stories in them than I did to textbooks for working with foreign language learners. I arrived in Hamamatsu City, Shizuoka in 1986. There were no textbooks to be had, but I did have books with narratives in them. And that's what I ended up using for the first couple of months of my teaching. And this ready access to books is not just in the distant 20th century either, the 20th century that some of you have dimly heard of, but also in the 21st century. Whenever I was living in Vietnam, I had gotten a Fulbright grant, and there were no textbooks to be had, and I did have books with narratives in them. And that became the basis for a reading fluency class that I taught that morphed into a speaking class. And then there's books and reading and books. I don't think that we really need to rehash some of the major arguments necessarily for reading in foreign language learning, but it is true that reading books remain the most reliable and enduring means for learners to get second language input and experience. And then getting input and experience is always a challenge in any country or setting where the second language being learned is not commonly used or has an official role. Books are such a durable technology, and the stories in the books, they're not going anywhere either. And I have a really exciting slide to show you. This is a 1920 edition of Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And my husband just went into the library at my university and casually picked it out to read, and brought it home. They actually let him take a book that's over a century old. Just check it out like any other book. And you can see in the left frame, you can see that this edition is printed in 1920. And then Twain actually dedicated this book to his wife. That is his original dedication. And of course, books have these amazing stories in them. In the right slide, you can see that this book is inscribed as a present to Carl Hammer Jr., 1921. Probably behind that sticker, it says "From Mother." And we'll return to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer at the end of this presentation with some teaching ideas about what to do with this extraordinary book. So there are some perennial questions that always surround using narratives and narrative stories in our classrooms. So first, why use narrative texts in foreign language classrooms? And second, who benefits? Third, what are some traditions from which teachers can draw teaching ideas? And then a newer question, which is, what can a multiple literacies approach do for teachers and learners? And we'll spend a couple of slides on that last question. Well, let's go to the first one. So why use narrative texts in foreign language classrooms? Well, I interviewed a teacher who has something like 43 years of teaching experience overseas. And he said, oh, to teach vocabulary, for teachers to show competency, to get learners experience with authentic culture that they can read and talk about and join the L1 club. And it might just be fun. And then this person went down the hallway, and then 10 seconds later, he popped his head back in my doorway. Same teacher, a few minutes later, he said, you were talking about authentic stories, right? Because those contrived stories at the ends of textbook chapters, they're like drills, but not knowing that you're doing drills. So here, his bias for authentic narratives or more naturalistic narratives became pretty clear in that short conversation. But some other reasons to use narrative text: it's for learners to get linguistic input. It's to develop learners' cognitive abilities. It's to learn that words have multiple meanings and that language variation is a fact of life. To become more aware of and more tolerant of other cultures, and then to develop translingual and transcultural competence. Learners learn about themselves through engagement with another language and culture. And this quote from Pratt, 2008, is going to come back. This is a person working in the multiple literacies tradition of using narrative texts. So who benefits? Advanced learners, right? Well, last night participants said no, but I'll add my 2 cents worth here. If you take the point of view that literary texts comprise a canon and that there are specific canonical texts learners must read, then literature may be viewed unreflexively, in the words of Jeff Hall, as suitable only for advanced learners. And that's often what they think in the United States about foreign language reading, that if you're going to read a foreign language such as German or French or Spanish, there's a canon, and this is only given to advanced learners. Also, literary language is indirect and symbolic, not what we encounter in real life. If you take the point of view that learners need to have enough language, and in the US, that means 2 years of formal study to read literature, then yes, literary texts are for intermediate and advanced learners. This is according to Elizabeth Bernhardt, foreign language educator here in the States. But I'd like to argue, if you take the point of view that there are many narrative texts out there of great appeal to readers' imaginations, and yet still accessible linguistically with help from teachers, stories are for learners at all levels. And I have here a quotation from a second semester American learner of Japanese who was participating in a study that I did with my research partner and one of my students. And this learner said, "The little pig continues to look at things, so I still got to practice with the verb to see and see new nouns. I liked koro koro because it is interesting and how the Japanese language has some things that are almost untranslatable into English." And this was a, low to middle beginner with Japanese, and they're able to have very strong insights about a narrative text that they were reading, which was from a Kokugo book for second grade children in Japan. And certainly SEFR, Common European Framework of Reference, believes that reading should be done at all levels. They do have a descriptor in their 2018 edition, which looks at reading as a leisure activity. Let me move this over so you can see what they talk about here on the right. It involves both fiction and nonfiction, including creative texts, different forms of literature, magazine, newspaper articles, blogs, biographies, etc., depending on one's interests. And I'll move this back over here. According to them, A1, which is the lowest level on their scale, can understand short illustrated narratives about everyday activities that are written in simple words. A2 low, A2 high. A2 low says can understand short narratives and descriptions of someone's life that are written in simple words. And then going to B1 low, there's a B1 low and a B2 high for this descriptor. B1 low can understand a travel diary describing the events of a journey. So we have reading as a leisure activity being done at the very beginning levels. It's not just advanced learners. And then SEFR has a kind of a newer way of, they don't just look at the 4 skills anymore. They're very interested in what they call text mediation. And text mediation in this case, you can see here, it expresses a personal response to creative texts, including literature. This first scale reflects the approach taken in school sectors and in adult reading circles. The scale focuses on expression of the effect of work of literature has on the user learner as an individual. And again, they have descriptors for the very lowest level. A1 can use simple words and phrases to say how a work makes him or her feel. A2 can describe a character's feelings and explain the reasons for them. Still, A2 can express her reactions to a work, reporting his or her feelings and ideas in simple language. So the Common European Framework of Reference authors don't think that literature is for advanced or intermediate learners. And I also believe that there is a SEFR Japan. Now, I don't know whether they have reading descriptors, but I'd be surprised if they didn't. All right. And then the perennial question about where we can get some teaching ideas. Well, there are multiple traditions of using literature and narratives in foreign language. And here are some of them. And then these are some teaching ideas that are associated with them. So we have a language learning tradition, meaning that learners improve reading, get more fluent, get more vocabulary, become autonomous readers. And typically the kind of activities that are associated with that or teaching ideas are extensive reading, repeated reading, focus on form, worksheets, and comprehension tests. Another tradition is a literary competence tradition. Learners get better at recognizing literary conventions, develop their general cognition, get better at literary response. Teaching ideas that flow from this tradition are teacher lecture, whole class or small group discussion, critical essays, and then a general education tradition. Learners become better world citizens and members of society, more aware and more tolerant of other cultures, become independent readers. And teaching ideas that flow from this are whole class or small group discussion, reader response essays, engagement with multiple texts on a theme, and also project work. So these are some traditions and then teaching ideas that flow from them. And now we get to this multiple literacies. This is just an additional tradition. It's relatively new, somewhat new, from the mid-90s. I have a colleague who calls it multi-literacies. To me, that's too much of a mouthful. I like multiple literacies, but here it is. Learners become functional in another language and thereby expand their critical language awareness, interpretation and translation ability, historical and political consciousness, social sensibility, and aesthetic perception. Whoa, okay, let's break it down a little bit. Basically, the idea with multiple literacies is that learners form social identities through self-determined interaction with multiple texts and with more expert peers. Learners then prepare for a work world of multiple social communities using multiple forms of given languages. And this is coming from the New London Group, 1996. There's also a very good website to look at. This is where I got the image from. It's multimodalpedagogy.com. They have some great ideas on this website and sample texts. All right, so multiple literacies instruction. Here's some teaching ideas. So first, learners experience the second language through multiple forms of text with multiple treatments of the text on multiple occasions. And texts are websites, films, audio files, flyers, blogs, narrative stories, my favorite, expository texts, and also visual art. And units of teaching would be a series of tasks and projects spanning multiple class meetings. That would be a unit of teaching. And learners do serious curation of texts related to their stated project interests. So learners are doing projects and the teacher is guiding learners with various texts. But then the learners learn how to curate and find their own texts according to a project that they will choose. And there's much in-class and out-of-class work that would be drafts or projects such as presentations, weblogs, from multiple feedback stages from both instructor and peers. And there's actually an example of two researchers who are teaching lower intermediate Italian, Gaspar and Berti, 2019, who have published their feedback system and also eventually a test that the learners take in order to get a grade on their projects. So instead of asking, how old is the speaker, instructors ask, what expressions in the text suggest the age of the storyteller? And this comes from Swaffer and Ahrens, also multiple literacy scholars. And learner production would be simple restatements of texts given their L2 resources and their L1 knowledge of genres and texts. So Swaffer and Ahrens, again, they assume that learners can understand and comprehend more than they can produce in a foreign language. So this is one of their statements about a teaching idea.
Greta,
So,
just I noticed
yes,
5 more minutes.
yes, thanks. So sounds complicated, multimodal texts, impossible to test learners, classes don't meet often enough, yeah, etc. So as I consider this new but not new text-oriented approach to foreign language instruction, I keep coming back to these things. Books are a reliable technology. They're not dependent on internet access or electricity. Books have stories in them. Narrative stories will always matter. Narratives will always have something to offer. So how might some of the practices of multiple literacies be adapted? So multiple narrative texts from a book or two, or a book and several printouts, can be selected along a theme to be followed for like 1/2 of a term, 7 weeks, 6 weeks. All right. Learners can be engaged with one narrative text or parts of a larger narrative over multiple class meetings with in-class readings and rereadings with slightly different tasks each time. Also, learners can revisit narrative texts read in previous weeks or units, and they will notice new details. When they return to a text and are asked to read it again, they'll notice new details. And these newly noticed details can be pursued in some way by the learners or by the teacher. And learners can be led to connect ideas between texts as they gain experience with them. So some of these ideas can be self-identified, or learners may be asked to identify with a particular character in a narrative, for instance, and then follow that individual in successive readings of future portions of text. And here we are back with Tom Sawyer. These are from the pages of this 1920 edition that I showed you. And this is the original text where the famous narrative where Tom Sawyer whitewashes a fence. And you can actually see that this is a very complicated, complex, interesting, culturally embedded narrative. And if you look at this, the slide on the left, now let her go, down with the engine, sir, ting-a-ling-ling, trying to gauge cocks. So this is a kid who's coming along, seeing Tom whitewash a fence, and this child is imitating the steamboats that he's been down to see on the side of the river. Tom went on whitewashing, paid no attention to the steamboat. Ben stared a moment and then said, "Hi, ye, you're a stump, ain't you?" So here's one text that the learners would work with, but don't despair just yet. Here's the next slide. What we could do is actually triangulate texts in this case. Here's one text, the original one. Then on the left, you can get a video from YouTube, and you can actually get the YouTube functionality to show you the closed captions, which they will then convert to a transcript on the right side, which you can copy and paste. And there actually is a video, Tom Sawyer's Adventures, in 2005, I guess it came out. And here is the same basic situation, but from the point of view of a dialogue between this kid, Ben, who's been down to the riverside to see the steamboats, and he sees Tom Sawyer. What's fun about closed captioning is it's not always exactly perfect. It's not a really true representation of what the characters are saying. My answer would be, great, show this to the learners, have them look at the video and see if they can correct the transcript. Why not? This would be a very interesting kind of activity. And this is a very different kind of language. It's the same narrative, but told differently. Hey, buddy, hey, my friend, that's a pretty tough job, huh? So I'm going swimming, you know, when you might like to come along with what I'm thinking. Tom Sawyer prefers to work. You call that work? And here's Tom getting in his hooks into Ben to trick him into doing the whitewash fence. On the right side of the screen, I simply rewrote the text from Ben's character's point of view, slightly simplified. I was walking around town without much to do. I went to see the steamboats come in. Then I went to see my friend, Tom Sawyer. He was always getting into trouble. That's why I liked him, I guess. And here's a short text. So you may want to take the approach of working with these 3 different texts. over successive class meetings. Slightly different points of view, some easier, some more difficult. So this was just an idea that I think is suggested by multiple literacies. And that's all I have for tonight. And this is a photograph from the Fort Griffin State Historic Site of Albany, Texas. Who says we don't have trees in West Texas? I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone, please turn your microphones on and join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Unfortunate-
fast. Whew.
Yeah, it goes by really quickly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to continue question and answer in this room. However, there is an area within the continued discussion section. I put a link in the chat. You
Yeah.
can go to that room. It's the same place as the help desk. But when you go in there, go into breakout room 1, because we are in room 1. If you go to breakout room 1, you can continue the discussion there until the cows come home.
Okay. I can go there for about 10 minutes and then I'm going to become a pumpkin.
Okay.
I'll be there. Thank you so
Can you-
much.
Thank
Please
you.
remember to stop your recording, Greta.
Oh, boy, I'm glad you said something.